For you, do you have what you need in front of you? So today we have our 5 speakers, starting with Jen and the crop circles in the United States. So many people are more familiar with crop circles in England and on the continent, and I'm imagining there's more than we know, whether it's the other continents or Australia. Who knows what happened in Antarctica prior to it being covered with what it is, all the snow and ice. But this is fascinating. I saw a little piece of this at the Pine Bush program, but now we're getting the full presentation and we're all looking forward. So Peter Robbins, who will be speaking after that, will come up and present Jennifer for us. So at this point, thank you all for being here, and let's welcome Peter.
Good morning. I am going to be your MC for the day, as well as be speaking to you later. And as is often the case, in preparing for a conference, you forget something. Hopefully it's not your presentation or something crucial. In my case, it was my sports jacket. Now that may not seem like much to you, but as the front person here, I'm not setting as dignified a image as possible. And I would just have one request for you. When I'm up here, please visualize me in a sports jacket. Thank you. I'm going to read a prepared introduction, but also say that Jennifer is a very dear friend, a very close colleague. We've worked on ever so many events together. We have visited crop circles in England together, and it's a pleasure to have her start our program today. Jennifer Stein holds a Bachelor of Science in Textiles from the University of Arizona. She is a business owner, artist, self-taught, award-winning documentary filmmaker, activist, and researcher. She is a state section director for MUFON, Pennsylvania, and the founder of Mainline MUFON, a Philadelphia area group providing monthly educational programs on topics pertinent to MUFON and noetic sciences. Jennifer is the host of a weekly public access television program, Mainline MUFON, at Radner's Studio, Channel 21, one of the great, truly independent television stations in America. Jennifer's interest in crop circles, did I just hear a change in this audio here?
Yes, you may have.
Okay. Began 30 years ago while researching ancient archaeological sites and ancient mound structures. She began traveling into English crop circles in the late 90s and became hooked on wanting to uncover the mysteries surrounding this phenomenon. Her research continues today with visits into formations and randomly downed crops in the United States and Canada. Jennifer is a member of the ICCRA, which is the International Crop Circle Researchers Association, has lectured extensively on crop circles around the world, and appeared on CNN and Richard Travis Canadian television programs on crop circles. Please give a warm welcome to Jennifer Stein.
Right in. We have a lot of ground to cover, and I'm going to be speaking to you for about an hour and a half. So I am going to talk about formations in the, and if you can't hear me, just give me this little hear thing so I know. I'm going to be talking mostly, I'm going to focus on U.S. and Canada formations because people don't know about formations in these places. They think they only happen in England. But like England, we have a correlation of mounds, ancient sites that we think are Native American, but we're not really sure. They might have been built in much earlier periods of time. I'll explain a little bit about what ancient earthworks and mounds are in this presentation. We'll talk about whether or not crop circles could be a natural phenomenon or not. And we're going to go into some of the scientific research, some of the peer-reviewed research that's been done on formations. I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the scientific theories trying to explain what might be causing formations. We don't really know, and I don't really have an explanation for you, but I'm going to hopefully get you to think deeply. And maybe I'll inspire you to become researchers yourself. But by looking at the evidence, we've kind of back-ended and derived some potential theories about what we think could be making these formations, and you get to decide for yourself. Hopefully we may have some time for some questions, but don't think I have answers for you. I probably don't. So a lot of my good friends, I'm married to a real scientist, and many of his friends say to me, Jennifer, like, why are you studying crop circles? We know already they're all hoaxed. So if you take that position, then your mind may be closed, but hopefully I'll open it a little bit. We do know some formations are hoaxed. These two gentlemen, Doug Bauer and Dave Churley. One of them has passed away. The other one is now in a nursing home. They were beer buddies in the 80s and claimed to be making formations in England, and the BBC did a big program on them as the expose about explaining why formations were being made. Well, they're still getting credited with making them, but meanwhile, advertising firms have picked up. This is Mitsubishi, it's using crop circles. This is Pringle potato chips, Sara Lee. This is an IT company in England. So the whole concept of crop circles is inspiring to advertising firms that hire hoaxing teams that go out and make these things. So when that happens, we can actually compare those advertisements that are done in the fields to maybe more anonymous formations that happen overnight in a couple of milliseconds with a burst of energy, as eyewitnesses have explained. And we can compare these. So it's really a great tool for researchers. I also like to point out that because you get sometimes counterfeit money doesn't mean that we walk around thinking that all of our money is counterfeit. So just try to I encourage people to keep an open mind to things. This is a quick little film clip with Gary King on a trip I was with Peter Robbins, explaining being present when a formation was made.
To give you an idea, there were a bunch of students from Oregon, 12 students, who were charged with creating the Mozilla Firefox symbol. And it took those guys 22 hours to flatten a 200-foot circle of wheat on completely flat ground, as opposed to that.
There have been several eyewitnesses. Nancy Talbot, whom I mentioned in this presentation, had a similar explanation, as well as Andy Thomas in England. I've spoken to a number of people who have actually physically been present when a formation occurs. The thing that I like about crop circle research, even though it has the same stigma that UFO research does, people think you're nuts to bother to pay attention to it. The unique thing about crop circles is it's a phenomenon you can walk into, literally. It's on the ground, and there's lots of physical trace evidence that we can do research on. And I think that's why I was attracted to research and study them. This is a photo of Peter with Gary King and myself, and right behind Peter's head you'll notice an ancient mound that we'll be speaking about. So people think crop circles are new. Actually, they're not. There's been lots of reports for many hundreds of years about them. Native Americans wrote about them. Even Shakespeare wrote about them. He called them the curse of the mowing devil, or he called them fairy rings. This particular woodblock was actually done and made in 1678 by a local farmer who wrote an article for his parish newspaper. He was very frustrated and angry when he discovered that his crop had been downed. And the article I will quote from, it says, "The devil may as well have cut the winter wheat and taken it away, as now it is rendered useless to me, creating a mess in the field. Why didn't the devil just finish the job and take the crop with him, rather than just flatten it?" So this wood plot looks like he's cutting it, but in fact it was actually flattened. Now, interestingly enough, there were reports that the sky was all aflame the night before above the crop as well. Very similar formation, characteristics that we find in formations even today. So this is a pamphlet you can find in the British Museum if you're interested. So the MUFON manual was written by this gentleman. The MUFON manual that deals with crop circles was basically coordinated by Jeff Wilson. He's the founder of ICCRA. It's the International Crop Circle Research Association. Jeff and his wife Delcy, who's sitting next to him, have held many conferences in Ohio. Hopefully they'll begin to hold some more conferences. Many different people show up that research crop circles, and some people have PhDs and scientific backgrounds. Chuck Lietzall has become a good friend. He researches randomly down crop, which I'm going to talk to you about, and the information we find from it. Just a couple of other people you may recognize: Linda Howe here. This is, I'll move on. Jeff's procedures and protocols are pretty clearly laid out. We won't go into them. Just that some of the materials you bring into a formation to research, in case you decide, is a digital caliber where you can measure certain aspects of the crop, specifically nodes, an electronic tri-field reader, so you can pick up any background radiation that might be higher than normal, compasses, shovels to dig up soil samples, GPS, and camera equipment becomes very important as well, just because you never know what you're going to catch on your camera. Sometimes you catch orbs of light and unusual things, or helicopters fly by. Both digital and analog cameras are very important, and magnets. If you notice, the soil is magnetic. And of course, tapes and tweezers and magnifying glasses to see things that might be too small to pick up with your naked eye. So just to tell you, when I first got into this, my first formation I went into in England happened to be a field where there had been a man-made formation done on a Thursday for a wedding by a gay couple with permission from the farmer. And on Saturday, when the couple came back to get married with their little entourage of minstrels and a couple of good friends, the farmer was furious and wouldn't let them in the field because this formation had appeared the night before. And they were, of course, stunned and shocked. So was the farmer. It was several times larger than the one they had commissioned for their wedding. So it was a great comparison for me, and I think this is what really got me hooked. And just to give you an example of the research that we did in this formation, I have a little film clip of Nancy Talbot and me. I'm working with Nancy in this field, and another gentleman named Ruben Udiarte. And Nancy's the founder of BLT Research. It's a sort of a loose affiliation between a man named John Burke, who was a geomagnetic geologist, and the author of a book called Seed of Plenty, Stone of Knowledge, and biophysicist William Levengood. Nancy herself was a music producer. She had a background in music science from the University of Maryland, and she also attended Harvard, and she worked in a scientific lab in Cambridge, so she had a real appreciation for scientific methodology. This gives you an example of soil sampling and crop sampling, how it's done. Samples are laid out next to each other and correlated inside the formation and outside the formation. This is me at the end of the day, and of course Silbury Hill behind me. I'm picking up the samples. It is grueling work. It is not easy, and it's pretty technical. I strung all the soil samples on my belt because I couldn't carry them. We worked from sun up till sundown. It's quite complicated to go in and do crop circle research. This is a brief overview of where formations have happened in the United States, just a quick map to show you. And Jeff has put this data together on his website. He has yet to update it beyond 2004, but he's working, and it's all volunteer time that he does to put these types of data together on his website. This is looking at the same information, cross-referencing it to years in which formations have started to be dated, that he's been able to find newspaper articles about, starting in about 1883 over here and going up to 2008. Now we notice a spike here. It's easy to take statistical data and make inferences, or maybe even take it out of context. We don't really know why there was a spike. It could be a combination of a whole lot of reasons. But looking at this data in terms of the number of states that have had reports of crop circles, we start with Ohio here, and we go all the way over here to New Mexico, even though you might think there's not a lot of crops that grow in New Mexico, and it's mostly desert. There are reports all across our country. This is another way to look at the top 13 states, and actually New York is rated 5th in that rating. And this data is all at ICCRA. So we're going to jump into some formations that have been eyewitnessed. Ken Keyes in 2003 noticed some sort of tumbling ball of light with several blue pulses and flashes in a wheat field near his house during a light rainstorm. So the next morning he walked out and he found this large clump of randomly downed crop. There was no fancy geometric pattern to it, but he actually took these pictures that night and during the day, and orbs of light showed up. He went out with a tri-field meter and found high electromagnetic readings, and Chuck Lietzau actually went into this formation and found similar unusual characteristics that we find in normal, or what we call anomalous crop circles. So randomly downed crop is a very important thing to also look at, because that happens a lot more than actually fancy patterns. But we see elongated nodes and central spirals, which I will describe next. This is a short little film clip with Nancy Talbot describing research that was done in Salem, Oregon in 1997.
All right, this is a case in Salem, Oregon, in 1997, out on the West Coast. We found node length changes in the plants in this formation, and we also found a massive incidence of expulsion cavities. The controls in this case were taken away from the formation in this direction and away from the formation in that direction, out to the standing crop. What we discovered was that we had significant node length changes inside the formation, and we had these expulsion cavities. But what we also found in the standing crop outside the formation, the supposedly unaffected crop, we found node length changes which decreased as a function of distance away from the edge, and in a completely linear fashion. Those are the controls taken north and south. The node lengths are decreasing the farther you get away in the standing crop.
So I mentioned a caliber. When we use little calibers, we can detect small incremental changes in node lengths. So I'll show you pictures of node lengths in a moment. But just to explain what Nancy was talking about, there's a principle called the Beard-Lambert principle, which means that if you can take your data, put it on a chart or a graph, and notice that you can draw straight lines between your data, it means that your data is probably not random. Now, this does not prove any sort of causation in any way, but it does show us that something unusual happened. And these are examples of expulsion cavities, and you can see they can be quite different. Here you actually have little circles you can see through in the crop, and here you have what look like elongated and partially blown out nodes. Now the theory is that possibly what we're plotting on this graph, and this is just a theory, it's the plant's absorption of some sort of microwave or electromagnetic energy that heated the fluid up inside the crop. The stem has nodes in it throughout the crop's length, and the node is the most water-filled aspect of that stem. And when it turns to steam, it's got to escape somewhere. So this node will either elongate or will explode, and it changes based plant to plant and crop to crop. If you're walking in a field and you actually see normal nodes and broken crop, you pretty much know that that formation may have been hoaxed or someone was in there doing nefarious activity. This is an example of a formation, nodes from a formation that happened in Arkansas in 2007 on June 14th. We started to characterize these elongated nodes because Dr. Levengood brought attention to them. So Jeff Wilson named them Levengood Node Elongation Analysis Test and put on his website a very quick test that you can do to determine if there was some sort of unusual, maybe electromagnetic or hydrodynamic activity going on in that field. Because if the nodes are twice as long inside the formation as in the control samples taken outside, you know that probably something caused that. because that's not normal. The darkening is caused by a process known as necrosis. It's a fungus which grows on the crop when the fluid is pushed to the outside of the crop. Here you can see there's not an expulsion cavity, but there's darkening, probably because the fluid seeped through the node as it elongated, and little insects fly up, leave bacteria, and that grows a fungus, and it's known as necrosis. It's not actually burning of the node as some people have interpreted. This is a formation from 2003 in Mayville, Wisconsin. This formation also had an eyewitness, Art Rantala. He was sitting on his deck drinking a cup of coffee, watching a rainstorm about to come across. Suddenly he saw a crop like wiggling across the road from him, and he literally saw it falling down in what he described as 12-inch sections, rolling down or falling down. And he went out the next day, and this is what he saw. Now, there was no lightning. He saw no whirlwinds, no balls of light. He saw no evidence of someone hoaxing this formation. But he called Jeff Wilson, and they went out to investigate. And this footpath here is what they created when they walked into the field. There are no typical tram lines created by tractors here. When they got in and they started to examine the crop, you'll look at this apical wheat head. It sits on the top node, known as the apical node of the crop. And can you see how this apical node is spiraled all around in a very unusual way? So the seed head was pushed off the top of the crop. Continuing to look at this, there were what's called blown node collars, expulsion cavities, and the soil was very magnetic. It stuck to a magnet. If you take a magnet into your yard, unless you have a lot of iron or magnetic particles from maybe a meteor impact many thousands of years ago, your soil will probably not stick to a magnet. But if you go into a formation and it does, you're likely to think something unusual is going on there. An additional thing happened in this formation, which we see a lot in England. Jeff and Chuck Leetzall, who was there, and Roger Surgeon, who were there, noticed a helicopter flying over. And then the helicopter came in very low and kind of buzzed them and flew around. And it was kind of distracting. And no one kind of understood what was going on. It got Jeff's attention, and he started to photograph this. Plug me up. And so he took a bunch of photographs, and then about 25 minutes later, this military man who identified himself from Scotts Air Force Base showed up and said, well, I just flew over and we saw you working on this formation, and actually the military is quite interested in this. Can you tell me what you're finding? Jeff didn't really want to talk to him. Jeff wanted to know who he was. He didn't want to really identify himself by name, so there was kind of this little standoff going on. Jeff got home, he realized that in all of his pictures, there was a white orb interacting with his helicopter. And we see that in England as well. It's just interesting. They also realized when they left, they were all followed. That happens a lot in England as well. These are some of the characteristics you find in with your magnifying glass if you're looking closely. You find insects melted onto the crop stems. This is found all over the world. This was from Saskatchewan, Canada. These are insects that are literally welded or cooked onto wheat heads. This is a picture taken in Holland by my friend Janet Ossenbar. So I was actually in this formation. It's up near the Stratford Music Festival where I go a lot in Canada. It's in Hensel. And I prepared this slide to explain a couple of things which are typical characteristics. We find a lot when formations happen, they are near power lines. Power lines appear somewhere in the field, and there's often a transformer box near one of the power lines. We also find that they are at the lowest point in the field. They're often near a drainage ditch. You can tell this is the lowest part of the field because when this field was planted, the seeds ran off before they had time to germinate into this drainage ditch, most likely. So this was winter wheat planted on this side, and this was some other maybe I don't know if this is corn or something that was growing. But as the farmer went to cut the winter wheat, found this formation. Now he left it and then planted another crop on the other side because there were so many visitors into this formation. But we also find a correlation to Native American mounds. I don't know where the mound is that's near this, but there are a lot of Native American mounds throughout Ontario. There's a snake mound in Peterborough, and I think there's some unknown mounds that have just been farmed over by farmers, or they let trees grow over them and they're no longer identified for what they really were. This is just a close-up of this formation. These are people walking on the ground, and of course a harvester truck. This is just a simple little formation in British Columbia. This is the roof edge of the farmer's house when he took the picture. There were animal disturbances he heard the night before. His dog kind of went crazy at about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. This is a rectangle in corn. This is the farmer's wife standing here. So there were blown node collars or holes in the node collars in the standing crop right outside this formation. And this is what some of the blown nodes look like in the downed crop in this formation, the expulsion cavities. There was no research really done on this. There was a phone call made. We asked the farmer to take a couple of pictures, but no one went out there with tri-field meter readers or other things like that. This was in Holmesville, Ontario. I was also in this formation as well. Series of circles starting 16 feet up to 55 feet. This was also in winter wheat, and it happened in July of 2008. There was a lot of geomagnetic storms that went on during this period of time, and a lot of formations that occurred. This is a picture you can see in the background. These may be some ancient mounds in the background. I asked the farmer, he didn't know. He said they were hills that he couldn't farm. There's, of course, cell towers in this field. And this is just a picture of what it looked like inside looking down that channel. And I have here a little film clip. I'm going to try to turn the sound down.
It's July 15th.
Okay, I'm going to turn the sound down because we don't have time to see this whole little thing. This is done by a friend of mine, Jack Wynn, who's an artist. But he went and walked through this formation. So I'm just going to walk us through because there's something important I want you to see right at the very end. He's walking around, showing you what the formation looks like, as you can see. And this is his wife.
That's wicked.
So I'll let you watch this last little bit. He pans back to his wife, and you'll see this little ball of light fly off her head. Did you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we'll watch that again. They didn't see that for several years on the film. I think they saw it 5 or 6 years after the fact. But we see this a lot in formations. This is another picture of a ball of light from a formation filmed by Steve Alexander in England. You can see the little pulsing ball of light there that he caught on camera. There's additional film footage here. I talked to the farmer, by the way, who was on this tractor. He said his hair was standing up and that his tractor engine was malfunctioning. And he turned around and actually looked at this ball of light behind him. This is also a very famous ball of light filmed near a famous formation known as Barbary Castle, if you're crop circle researchers. That's definitely not a bird. Now, this little piece of footage was filmed by John Whalen in, I think, 1998. I cannot vouch for the credibility of it. It's dark. It was filmed at like 3:34 in the morning, and he didn't even see this on his camera. It was filmed with an analog camera. John Whalen worked at a small little video place, and he brought the film footage in and had it lightened so they could see what was on the tape, and then ran into the local barge and shared it with a bunch of other crop circle researchers. He gave the footage away. He didn't have any attachment to it. He didn't ask any money for it. But it's a highly contested piece of footage. A lot of people claim it's completely fake and false, and they generated it. Pretty much, as far as I know, the level of that video lab did not have digital editing equipment at that time. They were still working with analog equipment. So it's highly unlikely that they generated that piece of footage. I don't claim to verify it or not verify it, but I showed it to you because it's what eyewitnesses explain. I'm going to hold questions towards the end if I can, because I have so much information to get through, and I really want to give you a good understanding of what formations are like in the United States. and Canada. So this is one from Revenue, Saskatchewan. We see similar geometries to what you see in England. It was quite a large formation, longer than a football field.
Wow.
And this one also had twisted apical nodes that were discovered. This formation also probably happened near a spring. When you look at the aerial photographs, this may even be some sort of ancient mound structure which has just been ignored by the Canadian government or forgotten about. But we always seem to see a water source nearby. That's one of the typical characteristics. This is one that happened near Stewarttown. This is up near Lake Huron, also in 2003. And notice the power lines through here, and this is a drainage ditch. This is the lowest part of the field. So you're seeing these characteristics happen again and again. Now, this is one of the most highly investigated crop circles in Canada. It's the Edmonton, Canada formation, done in 1999. It was researched. Some of the characteristics here were very unusual apical node elongations, like I was showing you pictures of. Seed germination studies were done that showed faster sprouting time, and there were cell phone failures that took place while the investigators were doing this research, and balls of light were also photographed. So this shows you how the samples were done. There was a number of samples done in all crisscross patterns, because we've been criticized a lot for only doing a straight line through the field, and people say, well, if it's north to south, you're not getting enough data, you have to cross-reference it. So we did, and there was both cross-referencing done outside of the formation as well, what we call the controls, not just the samples. So there were half-cup soil samples gathered, and it took about 3 days to sample this formation. And the samples showed definite node elongations that occurred both in some standing crop and also in downed crop. These you could actually put a little needle through this crop. Dr. Sampath Iyengar, who is he's no longer living, but he was a well-known geochemist, a mineralologist, and an expert in X-ray diffraction. And he studied clay mineral science. So he decided to take the soil samples and carried out X-ray diffraction analysis on these clay minerals in his lab. Specifically, they looked at what's known as illite and smectite type soils. And he was looking to see if the soils were more crystalline. So one of the things they do is they use these X-rays, and the X-rays diffract data back to a graph. And the graph produces these points, and what these points are actually representing is it's referred to as a Kubler index, and the Kubler index is showing you a decrease in moisture, which means they're showing you an increase in crystallinity. And just to explain this a little further, what's going on in the clay minerals, this is sort of just a sample from the web of a typical, I don't know if this was chlorite or not that I picked, but what it's showing you is the surface layer of the liquid in here, the H2O, is very consistent. All the water forms these layers within the soil. So when there's a lot of moisture in the soil, whether that moisture is caused by chlorite or other types of compounds like ethanol or glycol or glycerol, it's sensitive to heat, and when the mineral or the clay is heated up, that moisture will evaporate. So it can lose moisture easily, but when it's heated for a long period of time, that structure in the minerals will change dramatically, and it will become more crystalline. And that's a permanent change, and it takes a high level of heat for that to happen. And the soil will no longer mix with water or become solvent. So just to do further cross-comparison of this data, they gave it to a statistician who really didn't have anything to do with X-ray diffractions, but he was a specialist in looking at Kubler indexes, and he looked at this and confirmed that the XRD studies that were done did show increased growth in illite and smectite crystals. And then he did a further level of data analysis and comparison. He took Levengood's node elongation analysis test, where he had marked on the charts where they had specifically high increased expulsion cavities in the nodes, and he compared that to the peaks in the graph, and he found out that these two pieces of data overlaid perfectly to a level of 99% confidence. So scientists look for ways to have data that line up with your physical trace evidence to see if there's something significant that's going on. So then, just to create another layer of expert analysis, they went to Dartmouth College to this nice gentleman named Robert Reynolds, who was also a world-renowned mineralogist and expert in X-ray diffraction analysis of clay minerals. And he came to a couple of conclusions. He said that the amount of energy that was needed to create this type of crystallinity in the soil was very perplexing and unexplained. He said temperatures between 600 and 800 degrees Celsius, which is about 1,112 degrees Fahrenheit to 1,472 degrees Fahrenheit, over several hours would be needed to actually switch that crystalline clay structures to be more crystalline. And he said any kind of heat and pressure like that would have completely obliterated the crop. But yet the statistical analysis revealed that there was a definite correlation between the node length data of William Levengood and these Kubler index charts to a 99-degree level of confidence in his opinion. So he said whatever caused the crystallinity in that soil also caused the damage in the crop. Now, we tested mechanically flattened crop, and we did not get any of this type of data. So he said there's something going on, and it's perplexing, and nobody understands it. And there's not a lot of money in crop circle research. Lawrence Rockefeller donated about $100,000 to have this study done, and it was almost completely, spent doing this this research. So as you can understand, there's not a lot of people that want to put that kind of money towards crop circle research. Going on to other formations, this was in Adams County in Ohio in 2003, a very large geometric formation like we see in England a lot. And it happened right near an ancient mound known as Serpent Mound, and it also happened right alongside of a creek. This is what it looks like when a formation hits a node of a soybean crop. It's a little different. The expulsion cavity was looking like this. We looked at the expulsion cavities under, a slide, just comparing them, the controls outside the formation and inside the formation, just a cross section. This is an example of where the formation happened next to this creek. These are 3 cars going by, so you get a sense of how large this formation was. You could easily tuck those 3 cars into one of those little tiny circles. Just to show you where this is in relation to Serpent Mound. This is the stream that runs through it called the Sayakota River. And this is the point of the mound that seemed to point to the tip of the snake. And this is just another visual to help you see what the Serpent Mound actually looks like. Ancient mounds, I have said before, are a curious phenomenon. Early explorers like Lewis and Clark found them all over our country, especially near waterways, which were really highways for the Native American cultures that were here. But the native culture said they didn't build these. They honored them, they did ceremony there, they had visions there, they were areas where they could access information. When they brought their seeds there, they planted better. And seed germination studies were done by John Burke just by bringing seeds to ancient mounds. Also, the mound here had alignments to lunar cycles that Jeff Wilson found that correlated with planting cycles. Some people think this relates to the constellation Draco, but we really do not know who built it, and we do not know when. I'll also point out there is an obelisk at the end of this mound that has been pushed over and is no longer visible, but it's broken and it lies on the hill here in front of the river. So if you ever go, it's in 2 pieces lying on the ground. Take a peek at it sometime. It's quite fascinating. Some theories are that the snake is a mimic of the river but we really do not know. There's also a cave that runs right under this mouth. Another very interesting formation, and I want you to pay close attention to this one, because as you can see, there is a footpath through here, but the farmer did not use any kind of tram lines. There's a water pipe running near here. This is the lowest part of the field, and there is a cell tower right here. But this is not downed crop. As you can notice, this is stunted growth crop in the shape of a formation. The farmer discovered this and called the local police, trying to figure out what had happened. The police called a local television station. And the television station, I think what happened is the television station heard the band radio call from the police, and they showed up to film stuff. And because they wanted to have some kind of expert discussing what was going on, they called the local university, who brought out a Professor Bagwell from, I believe it was, give me a second to find my notes here. I got behind in my paperwork. Yes, Professor Bagwell, he was from Louisiana State University's agricultural department. And he explained that this formation was a result of some sort of elaborate hoax, that someone had sprayed chemical inhibitor on the crop, and that's why this crop was not growing the same height as the rest of the crop. Now, something that you have to keep in mind is there were over 25 circles in this crop, and that was over 1/4 mile long. I don't know if any of you have ever had your yard sprayed by like a chemical company. If you see the size of truck that comes out and the type of cable that they use to just spray your yard for some weeds, how in the heck could someone get in this field and not literally kill this young crop as it was coming up? Their footpath would have been easily seen as well. So Professor Levengood had done a lot of seed germination studies. I'm going to see a film clip next with William Levengood. He created a research lab in his home to do specific research on crop circles, and he published a lot of his work in scientifically reviewed journals like Physiologica Plantarium and many science journals in the United States. And Nancy Talbot's going to discuss a little bit about his work and her work with him.
And what Levengood documented beautifully, and I would guess tediously for many, many years, were the basic changes in the plants. One of the things that he discovered was that the seeds taken from crop circle plants grew totally differently than the controls. What this is a bunch of seeds taken from a formation and a bunch of seeds from the controls in a lab tray. And he's germinating. He has a germination chamber. It's calibrated to a certain temperature, a certain amount of moisture, etc., etc. If the crop was young and immature, the seed was not fully formed when the crop circle occurred, the seedling was depressed, the seedling's energies. Often they wouldn't germinate, and if they did germinate, not strongly enough to be viable. However, in mature crop, where the seed was already formed when the energies hit, then you got exactly the opposite. You got increased growth and yield.
So this last point that Nancy makes here is extremely important. This seed hardiness so astonished Professor Levengood that he and John Burke actually patented a piece of equipment that they invented. It was called MIR stress guard, and they basically mimicked the seed abnormalities that they were finding in crop circles to increase the germination rate and speed, and also increase the hardiness of the crop. And some went on to do further research on trash that Levengood was throwing out, because he only did these germination studies for 12 days. Then he would put these seedlings that were growing in his basement, sometimes in a plastic bag without any water or light, for months. And friends would show up and help him and see his research and take out his trash. And they'd be coming out with these stalks of crops. So some people took those seedlings home from those crops that were growing in his basement without water or light, and did seed germination studies on them, and found this seed hardiness lasted up for 7 generations. So that's not verified scientifically, it's anecdotal, but I think it's very interesting information. We no longer have Professor Levengood. This is one of the last pictures that was photographed of him. He passed away about 1.5 years ago. And Chuck Lietzall sent me this picture of Professor Levengood this week. So obviously, if Professor Bagwell would have looked at some of the scientific peer-reviewed literature, it wouldn't have been reported as fact. This was some sort of hoax perpetrated by spraying chemical onto the crop. Had that farmer been growing organically grown wheat, he would not have been able to sell it. I seem to remember there was a problem with the report, something to that effect, but I'm not exactly sure, so we will move on. The formation of ancient mound that happens to be right near where this formation occurred, that we were just looking at, is called the Place of Rings. It's in Ypres, Louisiana, and it's very interesting. This is the plaque you see when you go in, and the formation itself, the mound formation, is a series of rings. It almost looks like a sound wave or a water wave. This thing that looks from your perspective like maybe a tooth is the walkway that you walk through when you go to visit this mound. And this here is a river that runs in front of this mound, and that is the river right there. I just thought I would point it out. There were artifacts dug up here that were dated, carbon dated to be about 9,000 BC, and everyone threw the data out and said that can't possibly be possible. I think we're discovering new things all the time about our ancient past and our ancient country. Another formation in Chillicothe, Ohio, with a very interesting geometry. Notice the tram line, or the electric power lines and telephone lines that run through here. Notice the chalk soil. You see this a lot in England, where you see those white horses. The white horses are created by the pushing away of the soil to expose the chalk underground. I'll explain why this is important further in the formation, but here's the riverbed through here. There's also an ancient mound structure here, just adjacent to this formation. This is what the mound structure looked like. These are drawings from Squire and Davis, who did research in the 1850s on all the ancient sites and published this material in the Smithsonian periodicals. And these were some metal artifacts that were dug up for, I think, the 1890 World's Fair, and they're in a Chicago museum. It's quite fascinating. There's about 110 acres inside these mound walls. It was a huge mound structure here, and it's no longer here. When Jeff was inside this formation doing research, he had an unusual thing happen on his telephone. They picked up certainly tri-field meter readings that were very high, but this message popped up on his phone that said, compass interference, please move away from this interference to recalibrate your phone by moving it in a figure 8. And if you can see the numbers here, the compass wouldn't line up. This side said 0.013, and this side said negative 0.3.2. So his phone was even having trouble. They had all sorts of unusual, typical characteristics here in this formation. Exposed node cavities, electromagnetic anomalies, and very unusual bends in the soil. This is a formation which happened in Miamisburg, Ohio. This was in corn. There were no tram lines in this field, so it wasn't easy to walk in and hoax this. I met a man who was in this formation who explored it, and he was a builder. And he said to me, Jen, it was like drywall. I couldn't put my knuckle into the ground in that formation, and it happened in the middle of a rainstorm. So when they went in to explore it, their feet were muddy, but when they got into the formation, it was completely dry in the ground where this formation happened. This is a close-up picture of that, and this happened right near an ancient mound as well. The mound is known as the Miamisburg Mound. It's one of the largest conical-shaped mounds, much like Silbury Hill I was showing you when we began this formation, this presentation. It's considered to be only from the period of time of about maybe 100 BC, but we're not really sure. There are about 100 steps up the side of it. Squire and Davis actually dug this mound apart and then put it back together, but I suspect when they did, that they didn't quite get it back together the way it was supposed to be. I'd compare for you the mound in England known as Silbury Hill and this mound statistically here, and they're kind of similar. They both have flat tops, they both have steps up the side. And of course, in England, the mound is considered to be more like 4,600 years old than what we consider our mound to be, only around 2,000 years old. Just a quick comparison from the sky. If you flew over these mounds, you may think they were identical if you weren't really paying attention and you didn't know what country you were in. Looking at other mounds that we have in our country, this is Newark, Ohio, a round mound that only is preserved today. Now, it's not high. There's a golf course in the middle of it, but this is the mound around it. This is another one in Newark. It's taken the photo during a snowstorm. And these dots here are trees. There's about 22 acres here, about 26 acres inside this mound. This is the town of Avebury in England. So there's a whole town and a street that runs through this mound.
Wow.
And this mound actually had many standing stones around it. Many people do not realize Stonehenge has a mound around it. And the mound looks very much like this mound. Do you see the opening here? So it's a circular mound. There's a ridge in the ground that's about 10 feet deep, and the mound hill next to it is about 10 feet high. You can walk up and over it. Another mound we have is Middle Valley Mound in Jackson, Illinois, also dug up by Squire and Davis and probably not put together. But when they dug it up, they found these interesting shell artifacts inside the mound. I just point them out to you because there may be something that has gone on traditionally in areas where there are mounds that relate to crop circles that the natives have written about and talked about and told in their oral history that are denoted on these. And we'll revisit this topic later in the presentation. So there's lots of other things happening that may relate to the same energies that are creating crop circles, and we don't know. This is a crop circle from England, but this is a dry riverbed on the Rio Grande. And a gentleman who lives near it photographed this one day and went out in it a few hours later to check out what it was. And the wind had kind of blown it around, but the dust particles in the ground started to stick to his pants, and his hair started to stand up. So obviously, he didn't have a tri-field meter reader, but he was disturbed by this because the dust was sticking to him and to his camera, and he didn't like that, so he stopped exploring it. These are trees. This photograph was taken by my friend Janet Ossenbard, who lives in Holland. It's a park near her house. She goes out there and explores, and I think she walked her dog here, and she went out one day, and suddenly all the trees were bent, and they hadn't been the day before. Another odd phenomenon is ice rings. There's tons of photographs of these online. I've just captured a few of them. People send me things because they know I'm curious about this, and I was sent this from some of my friends and researchers in England. So, of course, this guy is an ice fisherman in Norway. He goes out on his snowmobile. The ice is so thick, of course, he can ride his snowmobile out there. They dig a hole in the ice with a chainsaw and fish. They go out to their their favorite fishing spot, and this is in the ice. Obviously, it was melted. They reached down and touched the edge and said that the edge was smooth. And there are many reports that when these are discovered, the central section is spinning. Well, I didn't believe this until I started to see videos on the web where you can see these spinning areas of ice. Now, this ice is too thin to walk on. I don't think someone waded out there in the ice and cut this with a skill saw or What causes these? I have no idea. This one was taken on, I think, the Chambers River in Boston, and it had a thin layer of ice with snow on top of it. And this was sent to me from Holland by Bert Jansen. Also very, very bizarre formations in the snow. This is also snow on a thin layer of ice from Europe. Very unusual. So the question is, what causes all these unusual characteristics that we're looking at? These elongated expulsion cavities. We didn't even talk about micron iron-sized balls yet, but I'll get to them. Magnetically dry soil, animal disturbances. I didn't talk about battery and camera malfunctions, but it happens a lot in formations. You set an expensive camera down on the ground to take pictures. I've done it. You pick the camera back up and start to try to shoot film with it. It's not going to work, or it shoots in black and white, or it's all snow, or it shoots in static, and you take it in for repair and you find out that the spinning heads in your camera are no longer synced, and they spin out of sync and your camera is destroyed, or some mechanism is melted in your camera. Credit cards have been demagnetized. If you fall asleep in a crop circle, you may not be able to pay your credit card bill, or your bed and breakfast bill, or your dinner bill. And it's a problem when you're in England and you just can't necessarily, without a magnetic swipe on your card, you can't go to the ATM and get more cash held. So the theory, of course, and the typical theory we see in the media is, well, it's all hoaxing or it's all done by ETs. So we're going to start to look at some of the other data and explore some of the science. This is Nancy Talbot talking about some of Levengood's theories.
And both Burke and Levengood, as far as I know to this day, are pretty much committed to the idea that the causative agency is an ionospheric plasma, and the plasma that's generated in the ionosphere, and then descends to the Earth's surface, goes to certain locations for whatever reason, the aquifer connection, some sort of magnetic anomaly or whatever, and leaves these impressions in the crop as a result. And it may be that many things which have historically been thought of as supernatural are in fact part of the natural world that occur only randomly or only occasionally or under certain circumstances, and that they're actually just part of the natural environment that nobody's bothered to study very much and doesn't understand yet. The thing with science, the beauty of it is, if you get a piece of information that doesn't fit, you have to go back to square one and you build another theory. You follow the data. You don't come up with an idea and then make things fit. You see what's actually there.
So she mentions an ionospheric plasma, and I'm going to try to explain to you what that might be. This is a generated plasma in a lab. There's a beam that's crossed here, and then that beam expands out against the wall. It's about a 100 gigawatt beam of electrified air or ionized gas. And ionospheric just means that this is occurring in the upper atmosphere, what could be called the ionosphere or the thermosphere, somewhere below our magnetosphere. Now, how could an ionospheric plasma develop? We know that solar flares push a massive amount of electromagnetic energy, highly charged particles, towards our Earth from the sun. These are referred to as solar winds. And when they impact the outer edge of our atmosphere, known as the magnetosphere, they sort of envelope around our Earth, and sometimes that magnetosphere wobbles or quivers, and that's known as a geomagnetic storm. And there are now warnings about geomagnetic storms you may be seeing, because they could affect our GPSs, they could affect our satellites. In fact, they have, and a lot of our satellites have been destroyed by geomagnetic storms. So the magnetosphere is the outermost edge. It's like the electromagnetic field around our Earth, and it usually protects us. And increased amounts of charged particles will funnel into our magnetosphere or through our magnetosphere when there are coronal mass ejections. And these come usually in at a majority in the poles, but it's not the only place where these highly charged particles can enter. They can enter right through into our thermosphere, which is an upper level of our atmosphere, not just at the poles. And what's happening is, the reason we see aurora borealis is that electrons are pushed out of normal valences in the gases in the atmosphere, and they jump to higher valences. And when they drop back down to lower valences, they release light. And that light is a photon, and we see these different glows in the sky based on the different gases that are affected. So the aurora borealis is really not well known. Only a few people have really studied it, and one of the early people to study it was a man named Christian Berkelin, which I'm going to talk about briefly. So we know that these charged particles are both magnetic and that they spiral. So these highly charged particles actually spiral in what we call a little Berkelin current. They spiral partially because they're opposite charges force them to spiral around each other, and our magnetic field lines of our Earth force them to spiral around each other. Now, these particles come into our ionosphere. At night, this ionosphere shrinks, and in the daytime, of course, it moves back down, presses back down on the atmosphere. Well, the nighttime higher ionosphere is what allows radio signals to bounce much further across the horizon, because it rises, it literally goes up in the air, and the signals can go further around the Earth. So we do know certain things about this. Now, what's important to realize is that most of our randomly down crop and our crop formations are occurring right in these pre-dawn hours, where this ionosphere is very thin and very weak, and is higher up in this magnetosphere, or towards the magnetosphere. Now, Christian Birkeland, let me go back. Christian Birkeland in the 1860s was taking pictures with a telescope of the sun, specifically of a solar eclipse. And he noticed these charges, or these currents coming off the sun. He called them plasma currents. They were eventually named after him, called Birkeland currents. And he noticed that they were spiraling. He literally could observe it through his telescope. And he had a theory that the aurora borealis was actually these spiraling currents hitting our magnetosphere, coming into our magnetosphere and spiraling and setting off light. And his work was considered, heresy. Nobody took him seriously. But 100 years later, finally the Navy put up some very sophisticated equipment, satellites with magnetometers on it that could actually measure the magnetic disturbance fields happening in the upper atmosphere. And he was finally proven right. And they named these the Birkeland currents after him. So that just shows you that the process of observation leading to theory, leading to eventual discovery, takes hundreds of years, and we're probably in that process with crop circles. We're not going to get answers very quickly. But this is what the Birkeland currents look like. Now, Birkeland currents create some very unusual other manifestations. You can see that there are magnetic fields here, and when these magnetic fields spiral around each other, you get unusual characteristics. What we are seeing as sprites, which pilots have reported for many, many years, many people have reported them, people try to photograph them, but this is kind of like lightning that happens in the much, much higher level of the atmosphere. The aurora borealis stops at about 50 miles. It's not supposed to come all the way down to the ground. Well, we're photographing sprites actually just above the cloud level and below the cloud level even at times. And we're wondering if these sprites are literally Birkeland currents penetrating down at nighttime closer to ground level, or if there's some aspect of them that can actually do that. This is a computer generated graphs of sprites that have been reported. This again is a computer generated model, but I'm going to show you some other pictures that have, or films that have been taken by pilots and even some by astronauts, trying to figure out what these are. We know that when these currents occur, when Birkeland currents spiral around each other, they emit electrons, and these electrons act much like a microwave does. This is one at pre-dawn hours here that was photographed. That was photographed by an observatory. There's the thought that there's a number of different fields interacting here. These usually happen in thunderstorms, so we have that characteristic with crop circles. They often happen when there are thunderstorms. It's possible, here's a picture of 80 miles up where you can see where sprites are. There could be plasma vortexes or microwave fields that are disturbance fields that reach much lower down into the atmosphere than the sprite itself. And these may be like lightning impacting on the ground, and when they do, causing unusual disturbances. So we think that plasmas will spiral around the Earth's natural magnetic field lines, and when they do, they kind of act like a cyclone here. Not so much like this model, but more like a cyclone, creating Birkeland currents that are intensified in our upper atmosphere. There is actually a couple of scientists which have written about this. A space scientist from Michigan wrote in the Journal of Geologic Research as early as 1985 that there may be some sort of downward spiraling and magnetic sector boundary crossings that are occurring at times of very enhanced activity or conductivity in our atmosphere. So this is not just theory pulled out of a hat. There is some scientific literature that might support this. Plasmas obey very different laws than normal gases as well. It's important to realize that we're talking about electromagnetism here. So plasmas can actually act like a microwave. Since they emit electrons, they generate heat rapidly, and possibly these sprites have microwaves that can be invisible and very short-lived. Also notice the circular radiation you're seeing in that video clip. We think that these spiraling plasmas might be much like this model, spiraling around each other. Birkeland currents wrapped around other Birkeland currents, wrapped around other Birkeland currents. It's a theory, it's not, it's a speculation, it's not proof, but there is evidence to support it. And you can see these spirals here. These are self-isolating spirals of energy within a lab-generated plasma. And usually they're self-isolating because they are opposite in charge. So there are fields within fields within fields within fields in this plasma. And one of the unusual currents that we get when this happens, and this unusual phenomenon, is called Bennett Z-pinch. Now, I'm not really a plasma physicist, but I'll do my best to explain to you quickly what Bennett Z-pinch is and what it looks like. This is a lab experiment where there are conductive wires not touching, but wrapped around the outside of this Coke can. And when this switch is closed and a circuit charges and pulses through here in opposite directions, that movement of charge in opposite directions sets up an invisible magnetic field that channels through this Coke can. And what happens is the Coke can collapses instantaneously. Now, you may think, this has nothing to do with crop circles. I don't know if it does. And I'm sort of speculating and bringing some science to you for your consideration. Walt Thornhill is part of the Electric Universe theorists who are proposing this is what's going on in the greater outside atmosphere. And this is a little film that he's generated and given me permission to use. So here is your Coke can, and he's going to complete the circuit by touching this stick to this ball. I have the film here for you just a few times to watch. So there is a magnetic, electric pulse going around that red wire, and the magnetic field that's unseen forces the can to collapse. Is this what's going on inside crop circles? Well, we don't know, but we're certainly seeing spiraling impact on plant material inside formations. This is just one aspect of what could be happening, but we're not really certain. It reminds me of these shells that we found in the Middlebury or Middle Valley Jackson Mound. Maybe there is some correlation. We have to remember, too, that the visible spectrum of light that we can see is really quite narrow. So when we're talking about microwave energy, it's outside of the infrared spectrum that we can see. So there may be things happening from sprites and plasmas that are in fields that we can detect with tri-field meter readers and other electronic equipment, like our cell phones that can't orient to north south and compasses that won't work, but we're not seeing the field, but it doesn't mean it may not necessarily be there. This is a little film that describes geologic conditions which could maybe force these energies, which may be unseen, to ground. This is Nancy Talbot describing the green sand aquifer theories.
It's something like 93 to 98% of the formations do in fact occur over this chalk and or green sand aquifer. As the summer comes on and there's less and less moisture and rain, the aquifer recedes. And as it does, it sinks down lower. As the edges of it recede, you got a strong electrical charge set up in the ground. because the water percolating through the chalk creates this charge. As the summer goes along, you see the charge increases. The lower the aquifer is, the farther the water has to travel through the chalk, the greater the electrical charge. The numbers of crop circles cluster along the edges of the aquifer also.
So upwards of 95% of England's formations happen to appear along this green sand aquifer. It's also important to note that England has one of the largest green sand aquifers concentrated in any one area. Now we have large swaths of these around the United States as well, but it's more limestone, not as much what they call green sand. So this is a very powerful aquifer in England, and it may have something to do with why large numbers of formations happen in England. We don't know, that's just a theory. This is Nancy Talbot also describing some of the findings we find in the soil. This is why the soil is actually magnetic.
You can't see a lot of these with the naked eye. But the fact that they're perfectly spherical indicates they were in a molten state as they fell to Earth, because that's how you get the spheres. We used to make lead shot that way, right? Revolutionary War, we heated the lead up and we dropped it off towers because it forms spheres. He also discovered magnetic particles in the soils that are very unusual.
So how could we get these meteoritic particles on the top of the crop? This is what I'm going to try to explain to you briefly next. We find large concentrations, 20 to 100 times greater inside formations than we do outside in the control samples, or just normally in our yards and things like that, and in other fields we go into. But we go into randomly down crop and formations with magnets, we find this stuff, and if we dig up the soil samples and look at it, this is what it looks like. Now, it's theorized that potentially a plasma, or possibly a sprite, some type of Birkeland current, could bring this meteoritic debris together and down to the Earth. What happens in a plasma is it's hot, like a microwave, and it's also electromagnetic. So this meteoritic dust, which is in the upper atmosphere, from meteors and things like that that have broken apart, these dust particles are coagulated and drawn together through magnetism, and they're heated through the heat of these electrons, which are free-flying, putting out microwave energy, and they're heated together. And as they drop through the atmosphere, possibly they're forming these little micron iron-sized balls we're finding on top of the crop and on top of the soil. Digging further down into the soil, we're finding meteoritic particles which are drawn together, possibly with other clay minerals in these unusual coagulations, not spheres, but maybe that soil that was there and drawn together in a higher concentration from the ground, and maybe these came from the upper atmosphere and penetrated through the ionosphere and in some way hit the crop when this formation occurred. We think possibly aquifers will magnify this attraction, as we were saying in the previous slide, especially in the summer when there's droughts and when the aquifer recedes, there's a charge which builds up in the ground. We know when there's lightning strikes, they'll pull you out of a swimming pool because nobody wants to get hit by lightning, correct? Or during rainstorms, they say, get out of the field, you don't want to get hit. Well, possibly plasmas or microwave energies are grounding themselves as well. With ground charge building up in the ground, there may be energies reaching up which are grounded by sprite energies or beam energies coming down. And when that occurs, you get this sort of reaction. Magnetically charged particles on the ground could be causing these odd, unusual camera battery malfunctions, cell phone reception going out. I've walked into formations with my cell phone and lost the call, and then jumped back out and got back on the call and stood on the edge of the formation and moved my phone back and forth, and I have no bars in the formation, and I have bar and cell tower reception outside. So there's obviously a magnetic disturbance going on. But if you have a large amount of magnetic particles in the ground that were possibly drawn to the ground through some sort of Birkeland or cyclonic power that's bringing them down to the ground, that could be causing your magnetic strips on your credit cards to be demagnetized. It's just a theory. Obviously something's doing it, and we don't know what. We don't have models of what we would call a large hydrodynamic fluid to show you what we're talking about, but these plasmas have also often been referred to by scientists as a magnetic hydrodynamic, meaning they're like water or they act like water. This is a little video clip done by Hans Jenning. He was a doctor in, I think he was in Sweden or Norway, and he just visualized with a camera for viewers what inanimate objects like talcum powder and water look like when they were activated by sound waves alone. These are not electromagnetic waves, but can you see similar formations like we see in crop circles, just with sound waves and talcum powder? He did these experiments with all sorts of materials. They're fascinating to go online and look at. He changed the vibration and got a static pattern, which maybe is what we're looking at when we're looking at randomly downed crop. Then he returned the pattern into a different frequency, and the spiral actually changed directions and is now going in the opposite direction. And this is a toroidal energy happening here. So the powder is coming up through the center like a donut or a bagel, going outside the edge and then spiraling. So you have a number of different wave energy patterns happening here. This is, of course, no proof of anything, but it's my speculation I'm sharing with you. So plasmas can actually change shape. They can snap, spark, expand, spin, squeeze themselves into threads of spiraling currents. Plasmas can separate into self-isolated cells, as I was mentioning, and they are impermeable from intrusion or force from outside that cell. Possibly we can see things that are happening in plasmas that look like this. I don't know, but I'm providing you with a visual image, because we know we can get straight lines in plasma activity as well as circular formations. This is ball lightning jumping around the floor of a lab. I just provided it for you to show you the force that energy carries before it dissipates. And this is small little electrified air jumping around on the ground. I wouldn't be standing there with thongs on if I was doing that research. That was ball lightning in a laboratory. So when I look at stuff like this in randomly downed crop or in formations, I often think I'm looking at if water or some sort of liquid-like magnetic fluid rolled across the top of that crop. I've seen it time and time and time again, and I'm curious if that's not in fact what happened here and in things like this. Maybe that's what's happening inside formations. We don't know. But this is a central formation in England, filmed by Gary. I posed the question, is it plausible that we could literally have energies, some sort of plasma energy, some sort of microwave energy, grounding its force, and as it does, it unravels its force on the ground, much like we were seeing in the Bennett Sea pinch, right into the crop. People say geometries. How do you describe the geometries? Well, if you look at how all things in nature form, they form around one of these 5 photonic solids. Even if you study the geometric shapes of all sorts of different natural elements, you'll discover this time and time and time again. If you look at pyrite, or you even look at the way snowflakes form, you'll see geometric shapes. So this might be something quite natural. Now, one thing we didn't discuss, and there was an excellent article in Open Minds a number of years ago by Michael Schratt, and I think this is important to share. If the noise is disturbing you, just pop back and have somebody tell them to be quiet in the room, and I'll try to speak up a little bit more because I know I can hear them too. So in Michael Schratt's article, he said that possibly what could be going on is there could be new equipment being made by our Defense Department, which could be used in possibly making crop circles. He said maybe there are actually crop wars going on in certain situations. He said that there are armament systems we have known as multi-mode directional armament systems, known as MEDIS for short. These are high-powered lasers that ionize the air, and they create a plasma channel that acts like a waveguide for a stream of microwaves. It sort of sounds familiar to what I've been describing. And he posed the possibility, from research he gathered, that low-altitude vehicles could actually discharge a complex plasma beam from a distance of only about 1,000 feet. And that could unfold its geometry and impact on the ground. Well, if this is what's making crop circles, then who was making them at the time of Shakespeare? That doesn't answer the question historically for me. Is it a natural phenomenon, or is there some combination of phenomena which is going on now, which is why we see more and more of them? I don't know. These are all questions. And I read a lot. I try to find other people's work that relate to pulsars and plasmas. Now, Paul LaViolette is a wonderful scientist, a PhD. I have a lot of respect for him. I've met him a number of times at conferences. I was reading his book, and in this book, Decoding Messages of the Pulsars. And in the back of the book, there's a chapter where he talks about a conference that happened in Princeton. It was called the Society for Scientific Exploration. And the keynote speaker was Jean-Jacques Velasco, who's the head of the GPAN, or SERPA, French Space Agency. So Velasco was asked after his lecture by a member of the audience if he could say anything about how he thought crop circles were happening. And he started to explain in French how they were created from this secret beam orbiting on a mylar microwave platform. And Jacques Vallée, who was translating for him, looked at him and said, "You're not supposed to talk about that. We're going to move on. We're just going to shut up and move on." And they did. Now, I got to meet Jacques Vallée last year, and I asked him about this. He didn't remember the exact question from the audience, but he remembered the conference. This is Jacques Vallée right here. It was a real honor to get to meet him. He was at Open Minds last year. So I look for examples of this, possibly. These are Googled satellite pictures. Hopefully you can see them okay. This is from the Tonopah test range at the Nellis Air Force Base. These are odd images in the desert. These are off limits to non-military personnel. One is a star-shaped pattern here, and the other sort of looks like a typical bullseye that you would see if you were doing archery practice. I think this bullseye is on the Tana Peak base, which is an electronic combat range. It's speculated that these are designed for target practice, but how were they made? What technology did they use to make them? It's quite perplexing. This was something that came out of the MUFON Journal, August 10th, 1990. There were two National Air Guard pilots that reported this and photographed it. MUFON picked it up and went out to investigate it. So Don Newman and Alan Decker investigated this September 15th. This was an area called Stein's Mountain. They drove out to it. It was basically a dry desert plain, and it had this very unusual pattern etched into the ground. There were over a quarter mile of these etched grooves in the ground that seemed to be about 10 inches wide and 3 inches deep, pretty consistently. They also reported that the ground was sort of electric, like the dust was sticking to their pants, and they didn't quite understand why, similar to what we saw in the Rio Grande situation. They said that once they walked around, their tire tracks and their footprints left a permeable impression and just began to destroy, part of this formation as they walked around it and measured it and looked at it. I don't know what created that. Now, this may sound like strange science, but my friend Carol Rosen forwarded this article to me. It was in major newspapers August 11th, 2015. The Air Strategic Defense Command, our commander, Admiral Cecile Hanley, went on to the major press at a conference that was going on in Huntsville, Alabama, where the National Missile Defense Community had come together, and they were bringing forward future capabilities and concepts to make our nation safer. And they were discussing the development of unmanned air-based platforms with directional energy lasers for intercepting cruise and non-ballistic missiles. They considered this steps to improve our sensory architecture, to better discriminate what's going on in space, sea, and ground, and even underwater. So it's really maybe not science fiction, maybe what science fiction is really here. So this is basically where I'm going to end. I'm going to open the floor to a few questions. We probably have 5 or 10 minutes for a couple of questions. And I think there's a mic over here. If you want to go to it, you don't have to. I can hear pretty well.
Jennifer, is there any evidence of a mathematical code or message embedded in the geometric patterns in these crop circles found throughout the world?
There was a mathematician named Gerald Hawking who found a mathematical code he had been looking for. I think it was called Theorem 5, and it appeared in a formation, and he was astonished because he'd been looking for it for years. So there's all sorts of geometries that you can look at and find significance from. But any type of significance is really just kind of speculative, since we really don't know who's causing them or how they're being caused. But yes, they have found it. Laird, I mean.
2 things. First of all, in the slide that showed the heart in the crop field from the married couple, and the secondary formation of the circle and the square, the square and the circle, right? The ancient symbolism of that square and circle is the same symbolism that underlies marriage in ancient religions. So this is not a random figure.
Did everybody hear that? You got to share this, Larry, on the mic up here. I don't know, can I bring this mic to you? I can bring this mic to you too. This is one of our speakers, Laird, who's going to be presenting later.
I just wanted to say that with the crop circle with the heart that the married couple put in the field, and the secondary symbol that appeared next to it with the square and the circle, the symbolism that underlies the squaring of the circle is the same ancient symbolism that underlies the concept of marriage in religions like Judaism. So this isn't a random circle, it's a response. It's a well-wish. The second thing is, the point I wanted to make was that one of the symptoms that goes along with formation of crop circles, according to witnesses, is a high twittering sound. And in some cases, they've been able to record the sound and have it analyzed, and discovered that it was at a frequency of 15 kilohertz. Well, on a totally unrelated topic, there were scientists who were trying to explore how to keep insects from destroying crops, and they were using lasers to produce flexural waves to get the plants to shake, and they were hoping to make the plants shake off the insects. They discovered when that energy reached 15 kilohertz, the plant bent over, just like you see in crop circles. So this is an energy process that's causing this to happen. You can imagine that if someone had a satellite with basically PC printer technology connected to lasers instead of ink, that you can pretty much pick any image off the internet you wanted to and create a crop circle on it.
Wow. Wow. Oh, I love that comment from the floor. You're going to have to send me that information, Laird, and that's going to go into the presentation next. Let me just go in order like this. I'll go around the room. I'll go with you and then back to you. Go ahead, Lauren.
Hi. Okay, so I missed the first part, so if you've already covered this, let me know and I can find out afterwards.
Do you want to try to use the mic? So people can hear your
Sure.
question.
So 2 questions. One is, of the crop circles that you've studied and other people who have they actually looked at all of them and kind of put them in a statistical database to say, okay, we know these were faked, because I guess you can tell when they use the board and they step down on. And then versus the ones that have the anomalous fields and the magnetite and that type of thing. So that's question 1. And then the second one is with the magnetite, that's the residue there. Is that in? Does it end right at the end of the crop circle, like when you get the control soil? There's no magnetite over there.
Okay. So first question: have they statisticized, if that's the right word, statistically analyzed the number of real to anonymous formations. Not really. I was mentioning earlier there's not a lot of money in crop circle research. Not a lot of people do it. And there's a number of us who are also looking at randomly downed crop, which continues to happen. You see it all the time when you're driving alongside of the highway, and we're finding these same unusual characteristics in randomly downed crop as we are formation. So when you start mixing in randomly downed crop, you know, it's like the numbers like go up exponentially. In terms of whether or not the soil outside the formation and inside the formation both show this magnetic particulate in the ground, yes, there is spillover and there is increased magnetism outside of the formation, usually a lot less, but there is some. And we find standing crop with expulsion cavities and things like that, even though it may not be bent over or down. So there is a spillover effect going on. I'll jump back here.
Yes, you're talking about natural phenomena that may account for some of these things. And I wanted to know, are you aware of the recent crop circle was near Stonehenge, and it was found the day after the Dallas cop shootings on July 7th. It was found the next morning near Stonehenge, and it was a 7-pointed star with 7 diamonds in the center, and circled with a crescent. So, you know, it looks like there is definitely some intelligence going on.
That's the trick, you know, is there. I think humanly we like to interpret that there is, and there may well be. But anything I would offer as a comment to that would just be my own personal speculation. I have no real knowledge of that, but I did know that formation happened. I didn't know about the correlation of the 7 officers. So there was a question over here from...
the date, not the number of...
Oh, right, the date. Yeah.
Well, actually, I wanted to mention...
Come to the mic so people can hear you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, one thing that I had wanted to mention is if you saw with the demonstrations of the vortex electromagnetism, you will have observed that it creates a spinning pattern, specifically that of a swastika. And this is very significant in that it was understood by the Nazi scientists connected with the Ahnenerbe SS that the energy that the swastika is represents the generation of Vril, which was what they referred to this type of energy. And there were a number of Nazi occultists who did connect this to actually markings on the ground. Specifically, they connected them to the runic symbols and how these were manifested by energies, conscious energies on the ground. So again, we can see this again through the, and how this was also then connected to the symbol of the swastika. So we can see that actually with the electromagnetic pattern that is displayed there.
Thank you, thank you. I'm going to turn the mic over to Jeff.
This could go on forever just with this one speaker. Having the ability to see all the speakers at their tables, I think yours is right around the corner over there.
Peter's computer,
Okay. And I will go over again and again. Please visit our vendors. So at this point, I'm going to give everybody a quick 5 minutes for restroom, move around. Then we'll come back for Peter Robbins' presentation, which will be for 1 hour. Then we'll take a lunch break, during which we can also visit the vendors. And then we'll come back for the 3 speakers in a row. We're looking forward. Any questions of me for housekeeping measures before we take a 5-minute break?
So I'll be back.
If not, I'm going to warn you, we're woefully behind on the schedule. I've seen